The compliment followed him everywhere. He's such a good person. His teachers had said it. His parents repeated it with pride. His colleagues admired him for it. Even strangers described him the same way. Helpful, polite, reliable. He never raised his voice. Never disappointed anyone if he could help it. Never refused a request. When friends needed help moving, he canceled his own plans. When co-workers asked him to stay late, he stayed. When family expected another sacrifice, he quietly agreed. People appreciated him. Some even envied his kindness. Deep down, he believed he was living exactly as he should. After all, what could be more important than being a good person? Yet something strange had begun to happen. Each year, he felt more exhausted. Not physically, something deeper. He couldn't remember the last time he had made an important decision that belonged entirely to him. His weekends filled with obligations. His evenings belonged to other people's emergencies. Even his dreams had become crowded with expectations that weren't his own. One afternoon, while leaving the office, his manager stopped him. "Could you cover another weekend?" He had already worked 2 weekends that month. He wanted to rest. He wanted to visit his parents. He wanted one quiet day for himself. Instead, he smiled. Of course. The answer came so quickly that it surprised even him. Walking home, he couldn't explain why saying yes felt automatic. He hadn't chosen the answer. It had escaped him. That evening, he met an old university friend for dinner. Halfway through the meal, his friend leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When was the last time you said no?" He laughed. "I don't know." His friend didn't laugh back. "I don't think you do either." The conversation stayed with him long after they parted ways. The following Saturday, he wandered through the city without any destination. Eventually, he entered an old library he had never noticed before. It was almost empty. Tall wooden shelves stretched toward the ceiling. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight. The silence felt different here. Not empty, peaceful. As he walked between the shelves, he found an elderly man carefully returning a book to its place. The old man glanced at him and smiled. "You look tired." The young man laughed politely. "I've just been busy." The old man tilted his head. Busy or obedient? The question caught him off guard. "I'm just trying to do the right thing." The old man nodded slowly. "And who taught you what the right thing is?" The young man answered immediately. "My parents." Then he hesitated. "My teachers." Another pause. "Society, I suppose." The old man looked at him with quiet curiosity. "And how many of those rules did you choose for yourself?" Silence. The library suddenly felt much larger. The young man searched for an answer. None came. He had spent his entire life asking a single question. What should a good person do? He had never once asked another. Who decided what good means? The old man gently removed a worn book from the shelf. He placed it on a nearby table, but didn't open it. "Imagine," he said softly, "that someone handed you a map before you were old enough to read. You trusted it. You followed every road. You never questioned who drew it." He looked directly into the young man's eyes. "Would you really call it your journey?" The young man felt something shift inside him, not because he suddenly rejected everything he had been taught, but because he realized he had accepted almost all of it without ever examining it. The old man extended his hand. "My name," he said calmly, "is Friedrich Nietzsche." Outside, the afternoon sun dipped lower over the city. Inside the quiet library, one question echoed louder than any answer. If your values were handed to you, have you ever truly chosen the life you're living? The old library remained silent. Outside, people hurried through the streets, chasing schedules, appointments, and expectations. Inside, time seemed to move differently. The young man looked at Nietzsche. "So, are you saying everything I've been taught is wrong?" Nietzsche smiled. "No, I am asking whether you have ever examined it." The young man frowned. "Isn't questioning everything dangerous?" "It can be," Nietzsche replied calmly. "But living an entire life without questioning anything is even more dangerous." They began walking between the towering bookshelves. Thousands of books surrounded them, each written by someone convinced they understood how people ought to live. Some praised obedience, others celebrated freedom, some defended tradition, others demanded revolution. The young man looked around. So many answers. Nietzsche gently interrupted him, and every answer began as someone else's question. They stopped before a large stained glass window. Sunlight painted shifting colors across the wooden floor. Nietzsche pointed toward the light. When you were a child, people taught you to say thank you. They taught you not to steal. They taught you not to lie. The young man nodded. Those seem like good lessons. They may be, Nietzsche answered, but that is not my question. He turned toward him. My question is this: did you understand them, or did you simply obey them? The young man hesitated. I suppose I obeyed. Of course. You were a child. Nietzsche's voice remained calm. Children must begin with obedience. He paused. But adults must eventually move beyond it. The words lingered. The young man suddenly remembered how many choices in his life had been made almost automatically. He chose a career because it was considered respectable. He dressed the way successful people dressed. He avoided saying things that might disappoint others. Even his definition of success had never truly been his own. It had simply been inherited. They entered another room lined with old philosophical works. In the center stood a large wooden table. Upon it rested an unfinished sculpture carved from marble. One half had been carefully shaped into the outline of a human figure. The other half remained untouched stone. Nietzsche rested his hand lightly on the rough surface. Most people believe character is something they discover. He looked toward the unfinished side of the sculpture. I believe it is something they create. The young man stared at the marble. So you're saying I should reject everything I've been taught? Nietzsche shook his head. No, reject nothing blindly. Accept nothing blindly. Examine. Choose. Then take responsibility for what you choose. Silence settled between them. The young man realized that this was far more demanding than simple obedience. Following rules required little courage. Creating your own values required constant honesty. You see, Nietzsche continued, it is easy to call yourself a good person when someone else has already written the definition. The young man lowered his eyes. He thought about every time he had said yes because he feared disappointing someone. Every dream he had postponed because it seemed selfish. Every opinion he had hidden because harmony felt safer than honesty. For years, he had believed he was choosing kindness. Now he wondered whether he had often been choosing fear. Nietzsche seemed to sense the thought. There is a difference between compassion and the fear of disapproval. The distinction struck him deeply. How many of his sacrifices had come from love, and how many had come from wanting to remain the person everyone approved of? They walked toward the library exit. The evening sun cast long shadows across the stone floor. Just before stepping outside, Nietzsche asked one final question. When you help another person, he paused, would you still help them if no one ever called you good for doing it? The young man opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. For the first time, he wasn't sure. And perhaps that uncertainty was not a weakness. Perhaps it was the beginning of an honest life. The following morning, the young man woke earlier than usual. Nothing in his apartment had changed. The same furniture, the same routine, the same calendar waiting on his kitchen table. Yet his thoughts no longer moved the same way. For years, every decision had begun with one question: what should I do? Now, another question quietly stood in its place. Why do I believe I should do it? That afternoon, his phone rang. It was a colleague. Can you cover my shift tomorrow? The request was familiar, so familiar that the answer almost escaped his lips before he had even thought about it. Of course. He stopped himself, not to refuse, simply to think. There was a silence on the other end of the call. For the first time, he wasn't reacting. He was choosing. He looked at his calendar. He remembered the promise he had made to visit his parents. He remembered how many weekends he had already given away. Then he answered calmly, I'm sorry. I can't this time. There was another pause. Then his colleague replied, I understand. That was all. No anger, no disappointment, no dramatic consequences. The world continued turning exactly as it had before. As he ended the call, something inside him felt strangely unfamiliar. Not guilt, not pride, responsibility. For the first time, the decision had belonged entirely to him. Days passed. He still helped people. He still listened carefully. He still offered kindness whenever he genuinely could. But something subtle had changed. He no longer acted because he feared being seen as selfish. He acted because he had consciously chosen the kind of person he wanted to become. One evening, he returned to the old library. The wooden shelves stood quietly beneath the warm glow of hanging lamps. Nietzsche was already there, placing another worn book back onto its shelf. "You came back." The young man smiled. "I think I finally understand." Nietzsche looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What do you understand?" He walked slowly between the shelves before answering. "I thought being a good person meant never questioning the rules." He paused. "But now I think a good life begins by asking where those rules came from." Nietzsche nodded. "Good. Because values are strongest, not when they're inherited, but when they're examined." They reached the same table where the unfinished marble sculpture still stood. The young man looked at it again. This time, he noticed something he had missed before. The unfinished stone wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. Nietzsche rested his hand on the rough marble. No sculptor creates by protecting every piece of stone. He creates by deciding what no longer belongs. The words settled deeply. The young man realized that building a character required the same courage, not merely collecting virtues, but removing borrowed beliefs that had never truly belonged to him. They walked toward the library entranced together. Outside, the city continued exactly as before. People hurried home. Conversations filled the streets. Countless lives unfolded according to habits few ever questioned. Nietzsche stopped at the doorway. Without looking back, he spoke one final time. "Do not spend your life trying to become the person others call good." He paused. "Become the person whose values you have had the courage to examine." The philosopher disappeared into the evening. The young man remained standing beneath the library's old stone arch. He finally understood. The most dangerous life was never a life without rules. It was a life lived entirely by rules that had never been questioned. He took a slow breath and stepped into the street. Nothing around him looked different. But every future decision will begin somewhere entirely new, not with fear, not with approval, not with obedience, but with a quiet question that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Is this truly my value, or merely someone else's voice still echoing inside me?